The reservation had been made for 7 o'clock. It was now 7:12. And Caroline Merritt was still standing outside the restaurant's glass door. Her son Eli's hand folded inside hers, both of them watching the warm gold light inside the way a person watches a fire from across a cold street. "Mom." Eli tugged twice. He was 7, and he had learned very early that 2 tugs meant, "I'm here. I'm waiting. But I won't rush you." One of those things children pick up without being taught. The way they pick up the fact that the house sounds different when Mom is sad. "I know," she said. She didn't move. The restaurant was called Harlow, one of those places with handwritten menus and small candles and exposed brick that had been painted white to look like it hadn't been painted at all. The kind of place where the wine list was longer than the food menu and the host smiled in a way that made you feel slightly underdressed no matter what you were wearing. Caroline was wearing the navy dress she saved for events she wanted to feel good at. She did not feel good. It had been her friend Donna who arranged this. Donna, who had known Caroline since college, who had watched her marriage fall apart from the closest possible vantage point, who had sat across from her in that horrible November 3 years ago, when Caroline finally said the words out loud he had an affair. "It's been going on for a year. I'm filing," and had simply reached across the table and taken her hands. Donna, who had been saying for 8 months now, "You need to meet someone, not to fix anything. Just to remember that there are good people out there." So here they were, 7:14 on a Thursday. Donna had told her almost nothing about the man. His name was Daniel. He was a single father. He was kind. Those were the 3 things Donna offered. And when Caroline pressed for more, "What does he do? What does he look like? How do you know him?" Donna had smiled in that particular way of hers and said, "Just go. Trust me." Caroline had trusted her. She had also, perhaps against her better instincts, brought Eli. It wasn't the plan. The plan had been for Eli to spend the evening with her mother, but Eli had woken up that morning with a low-grade fever that was gone by noon, and her mother had a bad hip and a worse immune system, and the babysitter was visiting family in Oregon, and at 6:15 Caroline had simply stood in Eli's doorway looking at him coloring on the floor and thought, "He comes with me, or I don't go." She had called Donna to cancel. Donna had said, "Bring him." Caroline had said that was strange, that she couldn't do a first meeting with a child in tow, that any reasonable man would be thrown. Donna had paused and then said, "I think Daniel will be fine." There was something certain in her voice that Caroline couldn't quite argue with, and so here they were. The 2 of them. Outside a restaurant that cost too much. Looking in. "Is the person nice?" Eli asked. "I don't know yet, Bug. Donna thinks so. Donna thinks a lot of people are nice." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. He had his father's eyes dark and quick, but nothing else of him, thank God. He had her chin, her stubbornness, her habit of going quiet when something mattered. "Okay," he said. He squeezed her hand once. "Let's find out." She pushed open the door. The host led them through the main room, and Caroline felt the particular temperature of a room changing as she walked through it, not dramatically, not rudely, but in that subtle way of places like this, where the people who had come to have a certain kind of evening registered disruption with a slight adjustment of posture, a momentary resettlement of attention. A child at Harlow on a Thursday. That was the disruption. She felt it land on her shoulders like a coat she hadn't asked to wear. She saw Daniel before the host pointed him out. He was sitting at a table near the window, a glass of water in front of him. And he had the look of a man who had arrived early and had been sitting with that fact for a little while. He was wearing a button-down shirt in a gray-blue that had been ironed but not recently. There was a faint crease running across the front that said, "I tried," and also I've been sitting in dark pants that were clean but not tailored. His shoes, she noticed when he stood to greet them, were a pair of leather lace-ups that had been well cared for, but were undeniably old. The kind of shoes that had been resold once and would last a few more years and would be resold again. He was not what this restaurant expected. That was clear from the way the couple at the next table glanced over. Then back to each other. He stood, and he smiled. And the smile was the first genuinely surprising thing about him, not wide, not performed, but real in a way that made his eyes do something, a small softening at the corners, and he said, "Caroline," not a question, just her name, like he was relieved to finally attach it to a face. "Daniel," she said, "this is Eli. He was supposed to be at my mother's tonight, but Eli." Daniel crouched down to Eli's level in the uncalculated way of someone who had done it 10,000 times, who knew instinctively that the distance between a standing adult and a 7-year-old is approximately the distance between two different conversations. "I'm Daniel. I've heard a lot about your mom." Eli studied him. This took a moment. "She's good," Eli said finally, as if offering a review. Daniel nodded seriously. "That's what I heard." They sat. The menus arrived. And for a few minutes, there was the comfortable activity of reading or pretending to read, which gave everyone something to look at that wasn't each other. Caroline watched Daniel over the top of her menu. He was scanning the pages with the mild, unhurried expression of someone who had not yet committed to pretending the prices were normal. She saw his eyes pause at the entrees. Something brief crossed his face, quickly managed. She looked at her own menu. The salmon was $42. Eli was not reading the menu. Eli was looking at the table with the focused attention of someone who has identified a specific problem. The problem was the glass of water that had been placed in front of him, a wide, heavy thing, clearly designed for adults, with a stem that was taller than the reach of his confidence. Caroline saw it a half-second before it happened. The reach, the wobble, the tipping point. The glass went over with the particular sound of cold water finding the surface of a white tablecloth, a sound that is somehow both very soft and very loud, a sound that announces itself across a room. Everything stopped. That was how it felt, the low murmur of the restaurant becoming a held breath. The couple at the next table looked over. The man at the bar turned on his stool. A waiter 2 tables away paused mid-step. Ellie went rigid. His face did the thing, the crumpling at the edges that preceded tears, the sharp intake of breath, the hot embarrassment flooding in before the understanding of what had happened had even fully arrived. Caroline was already reaching for her napkin. "It's okay, Bug," but Daniel moved first. Not quickly, not with the jerky urgency of someone trying to manage a situation. He moved with the kind of calm that is not practiced but is simply present. He moved the breadbasket out of the water's path. He set his napkin down flat to absorb it, and then he turned to Eli, and his voice, when he spoke, was so easy it sounded like they were still just talking. "Do you know what I did last week?" he said. Eli blinked at him. The crumpling held in suspension. "I knocked an entire cup of coffee onto my laptop." Daniel shook his head slowly, with the expression of a man recounting a minor personal catastrophe. "The whole thing. Gone. And the worst part, I was the only one there. No one even saw it happen. So I had to just sit there, alone, being embarrassed at myself." The waiter arrived with a fresh cloth. Daniel thanked him, used it efficiently, and slid a dry napkin in front of Eli without ceremony. The way you'd hand someone a tool. Eli's face had done something remarkable in the last 30 seconds. The crumpling had simply dissolved. "Did the laptop break?" he asked. "It did not," Daniel said. Which is the miracle part of the story. Turns out the fan dried it out. But I didn't know that for 2 days, so I spent 2 days certain I'd destroyed it. I spilled juice on my mom's keyboard once. What happened? It was fine, but she made a face. Daniel looked at Caroline. "The face?" he said, with the careful tone of someone asking to hear more about a legend. Despite herself, despite the tight, careful way she'd been holding herself since they sat down, Caroline felt the corner of her mouth lift. "The face," she confirmed. The waiter brought a new glass of water for Eli, a smaller one, without a stem, and Caroline didn't know whether Daniel had quietly asked for this or whether the waiter had simply made the judgment himself. But either way it arrived, and Eli received it with the solemn relief of someone who had been given a second chance. The couple at the next table returned to their dinner. The man at the bar faced forward again. The held breath of the room released, and the murmur of other people's conversations resumed. And the evening continued. It took Caroline a moment to understand what had happened, and when she did, it arrived less like a realization and more like a slow recognition, the feeling of seeing something you already knew, He had not made it a moment. He had not made Eli feel like the child who had disrupted the restaurant. He had taken the accident and turned it, gently and without any visible effort, into a small shared story. A thing between the two of them. A thing that was already, by the time the new water arrived, almost funny. She looked at him over the rim of her menu, and he was reading the wine list with the same slightly concentrated expression he'd had when he read the entree prices. And he didn't look up, and she had the sudden sense that he would not look up until he was sure she had recovered, that he was giving her the grace of not being watched while she settled. She ordered the pasta. He ordered the chicken. For Eli, Daniel suggested the grilled cheese with complete seriousness. Consulting with Eli about whether he wanted the fries on the side or in a separate bowl, the negotiation conducted with the gravity of a state dinner. Eli chose the separate bowl. This was clearly correct. The food took a while to come, and in that space, they talked. Not about the big things, not yet. The big things waited, as they always do, for the middle of the meal, for when the first drink has been finished, and the second is half gone, and the body has relaxed into the chair, and the person across from you has stopped being a stranger and started being a person. They talked about ordinary things first. Where they lived, he was in the Maple Hill neighborhood, 3 blocks from an elementary school, which he said with the rueful smile of someone who understood the specific noise that location produced at 7:30 in the morning. She was in Westfield, a house she'd bought after the divorce, a house that was too large for 2 people, and that she had been quietly making smaller and more theirs ever since. Eli ate his grilled cheese and drew a complicated map on his paper placemat with a crayon the waiter had produced from somewhere. The map appeared to be of a country he had invented, which had regions named after things he liked. Dinosaurville, the Cheese Ocean, mountain climbing place. What do they export? Daniel asked, looking at the map with genuine interest. Eli considered. Cheese. From the ocean. It's a different kind of cheese. It grows in the water. Ocean brie, Daniel said. I'd try it. You'd have to go through the border, Eli said. He pointed at a squiggly line he'd drawn in blue crayon. They check your things. What do they check for? Eli thought about it very seriously. Crackers, he said finally. You can't bring crackers in. You have to buy them on the other side. Protectionist cheese economy, Daniel said to Caroline. Impressive. And in this easy way, the evening opened. There was something she appreciated about watching him talk to Eli, or rather, watching him not perform the talking. She had been on enough attempts at social interaction since the divorce, most of them just ordinary dinners with friends who brought their partners, to know what the performance of Good with Kids looked like. The exaggerated interest, the crouching down to eye-level theatrics, followed immediately by a return to the adult conversation, the high-pitched brightness that children saw through in approximately 30 seconds. Daniel did none of that. He talked to Eli the way he talked to her at a normal register, with actual interest, with follow-up questions that suggested he had retained the previous answer. It was not a performance, it was just how he was. Somewhere between the entrees and the dessert menu, the conversation found its way to the harder things, not dramatically, not in the way of confessions or revelations, but in the natural way of 2 people who have both carried weight for a long time and have learned how to carry it without display. He had been married for 6 years. His daughter, Sophie, was 9 now and lived with him 5 days a week. He talked about her the way people talk about something they love more than they have words for with economy, because the words available are not sufficient. And you learn to say less rather than say the wrong thing. Sophie liked swimming and hated mornings, and had recently become deeply interested in weather systems, which Daniel said, with a look of benign bewilderment. He said he had been late to a meeting last Tuesday because he had been required to watch the radar on the weather app with her before school. She wanted to explain the pressure systems, he said. Do you understand pressure systems? I do now. Is she right about the pressure systems, as best I can tell? I started fact-checking a few things early on, and stopped when I realized she was always correct. Because the fact-checking was just making me feel bad, Caroline smiled. Sophie sounds like someone I'd like. She'd say a lot, he said, and it was entirely a compliment. Caroline had been married for 5 years. Eli's father, whose name she did not offer and Daniel did not ask for, was in Boston now, or somewhere. She was not always certain. He sent support payments reliably, which was the best she could say about him in recent years. And she said it without bitterness, only with the flat neutrality of a person who had been angry for a long time and had worked very hard to put the anger somewhere it could not reach her son. She had gone back to work full-time. 18 months ago, she was a project manager at a mid-size architecture firm downtown. It was good work. She was good at it. The days were long, and Eli went to aftercare, and she picked him up at 5:30, and they ate dinner together at the kitchen table, and she read to him before bed even now, even at 7, because it was the ritual that made the day feel like it had ended correctly. She had organized their life into a structure she could maintain, and maintaining it had been, for a while, the whole of what she asked of herself. Daniel listened to this the way she had noticed, over the course of the evening, that he listened to most things with complete attention. Without offering his next thought before she had finished hers, without nodding in the performed way of someone waiting to respond, he asked questions that were not too probing but were not deflective either. Questions that said, "I'm following you. I want to understand. Not just to know. What do you read?" he asked. "Right now we're doing Roald Dahl." Before that, the Narnia books. How did Eli feel about Narnia? Eli, who had been listening to this conversation from behind his drawing children, always hear more than they appear to spoke without looking up. "The lion dies," he said. "But then he comes back." "That's about right," Daniel agreed. "It was sad," Eli said. Even knowing about the coming back part, Daniel nodded slowly. He held the thought for a moment before he answered. And she noticed he did this gave things a beat. As though he wanted to be sure he was saying what he meant, and not just what arrived first. "Sometimes the coming back doesn't make the sad part smaller," he said. "Both things can be true at once." Eli looked up at him then, with the slow evaluation of a child deciding whether a piece of information is being given to him straight, or whether it's the kind of answer adults give when they don't know what to say to children. He seemed to decide it was the first kind. He looked at Daniel for another moment, long and assessing. And then he looked back at his map. Caroline looked at Daniel. He was looking at Eli's drawing. And the expression on his face was quiet and unguarded. The face of a person who is simply present in a moment without managing it, and she felt something shift in the region of her chest, not a dramatic shift, not a falling, but the kind of small internal readjustment that happens when something you believe to be one thing turns out to be slightly different. She had come here certain of very little, except the intention not to expect anything. She had not expected to find herself, 90 minutes in, quietly revising the terms of that. She noticed the conversation at the next table at some point during the main course. The way you notice something that has been present for a while but only becomes audible when it crosses a certain threshold. The couple, he in a suit jacket, she in what Caroline recognized as a very expensive blouse, had been talking in the low tones of people who believed themselves inaudible, which they were not. She caught fragments. "Doesn't quite fit, does he?" And, "Wonder what she's doing here with." And something else she couldn't make out, but understood from the quick glance the woman threw toward their table. It was not unusual. Caroline had been aware of it in a peripheral way since they arrived, the slight recalibration of the room when Daniel walked in, the specific quality of attention that men in old shoes receive in restaurants like Harlow, the quiet arithmetic that strangers perform without meaning to, or maybe meaning to, or maybe not examining whether they mean to. She had felt it. She had told herself it didn't matter, because she was still deciding, because she owed no one anything, because she was here for herself, and for Donna's faith, and for the mild experiment of seeing whether there was anything left in her that could open to another person. But it had been easier to hold that indifference when she was still deciding. Now she found it harder, because somewhere between Eli's water glass and Daniel's dead laptop and Sophie's pressure systems and the way he had said both things can be true at once, she had begun to find herself, against considerable caution, on his side. There was also the man who had been waiting at the bar since before they arrived. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that came with money and good tailoring, and the knowledge of both. He'd sent a drink to their table at some point. Caroline had declined it politely. She had a glass of wine she was working through, and when the waiter brought the message that it was from the gentleman at the bar, She had felt Daniel go very slightly still, not tense, just still. The man at the bar had looked at their table once after that, a look that contained the practiced casualness of someone exercising restraint in the presence of something they considered theirs by right, and then he had gone back to his phone. Daniel had not acknowledged the look, had not stiffened, had not responded, had not done any of the things that would have made the moment larger than it needed to be. He had, instead, asked Eli whether the cheese ocean had a capital city. It did. It was called Fort Cheddar. The check came when the dessert plates were cleared. The waiter set it near Daniel's side of the table, with the mild neutrality that waiters in good restaurants use for this moment. Not assuming, not quite. Caroline reached for her card. This was a thing she was prepared for, had always been prepared for, would always be prepared for. Daniel said, quietly, "I've got it. You don't have to, I know." He was already opening the small leather folder, not making a production of it, just doing it the way you'd do any practical thing. "I wanted the evening to happen. It's on me." She let him. She had learned, in the years since the divorce, to choose which hills to defend. This was not one of them. What happened next, she saw without meaning to. He was writing in the tip line, and she was looking at Eli, who had fallen asleep suddenly, completely, the way small children do, his head tipped against the back of his chair with his mouth slightly open, and the crayoned map of his invented country still on the table in front of him, and she happened to glance back at Daniel's hand, just as he was closing. The folder. She had been in enough restaurants to calibrate what a generous tip looked like against the total on a bill. What she saw was beyond generous. It was significant, the kind of amount that required deliberate intention, that said something about how you thought the people who served you should be treated. He set the folder on the edge of the table and folded his hands and looked at the sleeping Eli with the same quiet, unguarded expression she had noticed before. The waiter who came to collect the folder was a young man, early 20s, with the particular exhaustion of someone near the end of a double shift. He opened the folder and looked at what was inside. And something crossed his face surprise, and then something fuller, something that didn't quite have a simple name. And he looked at Daniel and said, quietly so as not to wake Eli, "Thank you, really." Daniel nodded, nothing more than that. And then the man from the bar was there. He had crossed the room with the confidence of someone who had decided to stop waiting, and he stopped beside their table with his jacket open and his hands in his pockets, and he looked at Daniel with the very specific expression of someone delivering a verdict they have already rendered. "I've been watching you all night," he said, pleasantly. The pleasantness was a weapon. "Interesting company you keep." Caroline opened her mouth. Daniel spoke first, and his voice was the same as it had been all evening, easy, low, not raised. "We were just finishing up," he said. "Have a good night." It was not a dismissal. It was not aggressive. It was something more difficult to counter than either of those things. It was simply the complete absence of escalation, the absence of the performance the man had arrived to receive. And the man stood there for a moment, uncertain what to do with the space where a confrontation was supposed to be, and then he did the only thing available to him, which was to leave. Caroline watched him go. She turned back to Daniel, who was looking at Eli sleeping, and had the expression of a man who was thinking about something else entirely, something private and quiet, some consideration that had nothing to do with the man who had just stood at their table. "You didn't have to ignore that," she said. "I didn't ignore it," he said. "I just didn't think he deserved more of the evening than we already gave him." She thought about that. "I have a daughter who watches how I handle things," he said, after a moment. "It changes how you decide what's worth the energy." They left at 9:40. The night air was cool and smelled like rain that had fallen earlier, and the street lamps made small gold pools on the wet pavement. And Eli was awake again, barely, soft around the edges, his head against Caroline's shoulder as she held him, his weight familiar and complete. Daniel walked beside her to her car. And the conversation had gone quiet, in the easy way of conversations that have run their full length, and arrived somewhere not at an end, but at a pause, a place where the next thing could go in any direction without being wrong. "He fell asleep fast," Daniel said. "He always does after he's been on his best behavior." "It costs him something." Daniel smiled. "Sophie's the same." She's very social for about 4 hours, and then she's done. Goes somewhere inside herself. Sounds about right. They reached her car. She settled Eli into the back seat, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this in parking lots and driveways, and late nights past counting, buckled him without waking him, closed the door softly. She turned around, and Daniel was standing at a slight distance, giving her space, hands in his pockets, and the street lamp lit him from behind, in a way that made him look not grand, not cinematic, just real. A tired person who had made a genuine effort on a Thursday night and had brought, to the effort, everything he actually had. "I had a good time," she said. It was true. And saying true things had become, in the last 3 years, the practice she trusted most. So did I. He paused. He's a great kid, Caroline. You've done something right there. She felt the words land in a place she had not expected them to land. Not in her throat, not in her eyes, somewhere lower and more central. The place where the things you've worked for and protected and worried over for 3 years quietly wait to be seen. "Thank you," she said. And then, before she could think about it, "I'd like to do this again." Something in his expression shifted a small, restrained relief, the look of a person who had not been certain the evening had gone well enough to warrant hope and was now revising. "I'd like that," he said. She got into the car. In the back seat, Eli was already fully asleep, his mouth slightly open, his hands loose in his lap, the inventor of Fort Cheddar at rest. She sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the street, at the wet pavement, and the gold light. And she felt not in a sweeping way, not with music, a thing that she recognized, dimly, from long ago. From before the long, cold years, the feeling of a door left slightly open. The particular temperature of possibility. She drove home. She told Donna the next morning. Donna listened without interrupting, which took visible effort. And when Caroline had finished, she said, "I knew it," in the tone of someone who had been sitting on 4 words for 8 months. "You couldn't have known," Caroline said. "I knew," Donna said. "I know things. Stop arguing with me. You said he was kind." That was your entire description. Kind. What else do you need? I gave you the one true word about him, and you're arguing? Caroline did not argue further. There was a second dinner, 2 weeks later. No Eli this time. Her mother's hip had improved, and the babysitter was back from Oregon, and it was just the 2 of them in a quieter restaurant that Daniel had chosen, one that had paper napkins and very good food and prices that reflected neither the ambiance nor the ingredients. And over the course of 3 hours and 2 glasses of wine each, they talked about things that people only talk about when the preliminary tests have been passed. He had grown up in a small city in Ohio, the third of 4 children. His father had run a hardware store that had eventually failed. His mother was a high school English teacher who was now retired and who called every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, a call he had not missed in 11 years except for the morning Anna was in surgery, when she had called him instead and talked to him for 2 hours about nothing consequential, while he sat in a waiting room chair and let the sound of her voice be what it was. The sound of someone who knew him well enough to know that silence would have been worse. He had gone to college on a partial scholarship and worked the rest of the way through, holding a job in the campus library that he described as the best job he'd ever had, because the hours were quiet and the material was inexhaustible, and nobody expected anything from him between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, except that he shelved things correctly. He had been an accountant for 6 years before the firm he worked at dissolved in a slow and badly managed way, and now this part came with a slight hesitation, the particular hesitation of a man describing a thing that does not sound impressive in the way that certain rooms expected things to sound impressive. A bookkeeper for a cluster of small businesses. 6 or 7 of them. He had built it himself, 1 client at a time, over the last 4 years. How do you find them, the clients? Word of mouth, mostly. One of my first clients was a bakery on the East Side. Owners were brothers. They'd been doing their own books for years, and they were a mess not from carelessness, just from not knowing what they didn't know. I fixed it. They told someone. That person told someone. It grows slowly. Do you like it? He considered the question with the same deliberate care he brought to most questions. as though he wanted to answer honestly rather than reflexively. "I like the small businesses," he said. "I like that I know the people. The bakery brothers have been in business for 20 years, and they still argue about the cinnamon rolls whether to add cardamom. I've been to that argument 4 times now. I have a strong opinion." "Which side?" "Cardamom." "Obviously. But I stay neutral for professional reasons." It was not the restaurant at the bar kind of story. It was the kind of story that required patience to understand. The kind that didn't arrive with a title or a salary to name before anything else. Caroline understood it. She worked in a field full of exactly this kind of story. People who had built something real and unglamorous and solid, who had no interest in being larger than what they were. She told him about her marriage in more detail than she had planned to, because the way he listened made honesty feel sustainable rather than exposing. She told him about the year she found out, and the 3 months she had tried to hold it together for reasons she could no longer fully reconstruct, and the morning she had sat Eli down and said something that she had rehearsed for a week and had not been able to say correctly no matter how many times she tried. She told him that Eli had been very quiet for a very long time after that, and that the quiet had been harder to hold than the crying would have been. "He used to wait for me at the window when I came home," she said. "He stopped doing that for a while. He'd still come to the door, but he'd wait until he heard the key. Not before. I don't know if he knew he was doing it differently, but I knew." Daniel was quiet. "He does it again now," she said. "The waiting at the window. He started again about 8 months ago. I don't know what changed." "He decided something," Daniel said. "What do you mean?" "Kids decide things quietly. They wait until they're sure, and then they change the behavior without announcing it. He decided something was safe again." She looked at him. "You sound like you've watched this." "I have," he said simply. When she was done with her own story, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He's not quiet anymore." She thought about this. "No," she said. "He's not." "You did that," he said simply. She looked at the table, then at him. Then she said, "How did Sophie take it? When you and her mother—" "How was she?" He exhaled slowly. His wife, her name had been Anna, had died. Not left. Died. Ovarian cancer. A diagnosis at 34 that had moved very fast and that had been fought very hard, and that had ended on a Tuesday morning in March 4 years ago. Sophie had been 5. She had not completely understood, and then she had understood more, and now she understood it, in the way a 9-year-old understands something that she carries daily, and will continue to carry in forms she cannot yet imagine. "She asks about her mom more now than she did 2 years ago," he said. "I think she's old enough to miss what she doesn't have a memory of, which is a strange grief. Missing an absence. Does that help? Talking about it? I think so. I try to tell her things. What Anna was like. What she found funny. What she was bad at. Because that matters too. Right? The real person. Not just the version that grief makes." "What was she bad at?" He smiled. A small private smile. "Directions. Completely. Couldn't read a map to save her life. We drove around lost for 40 minutes, once trying to find a restaurant that was 2 blocks from where we started." "Fort Cheddar," Caroline said. He looked at her. "Lost trying to find Fort Cheddar," she said. "It's on the map. The Cheese Ocean is to the north. You'd think you'd be able to see it." He laughed a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed his face completely, opened it, and she sat across from him in the paper napkin restaurant, and felt the door that had been left slightly open move another inch. It was a Saturday in October, about 6 weeks after the first dinner, when she understood that something had already been decided by someone other than her. Daniel had come over for the afternoon, a thing that had started happening on Saturdays, arriving after his morning with Sophie. She had a swim lesson. She was competitive about her times, arriving with the easy comfort of someone who had learned where things were, the good coffee cups, the one drawer that stuck, the back door that needed to be lifted slightly to close properly. He always brought something, not in a showy way, not in the way of someone marking territory with gifts, but practically. Last week, it had been a jar of honey from a farmer's market near Sophie's school. The week before, a book about geological formations that he'd found at a used bookstore and that he'd thought Eli might like, because Eli had mentioned once, in passing, that he wondered how mountains happened. Eli had read 30 pages of it the same afternoon it arrived. Today, he and Eli were in the backyard. Caroline was watching from the kitchen window, doing nothing she could fully account for, later holding her coffee, not drinking it, watching. They were building something, a bird feeder, she thought. Though it had evolved through a number of earlier iterations throughout the fall, first a birdhouse, then a fort for smaller creatures. Now, apparently a bird feeder. Eli was explaining something in the detailed, slightly emphatic way he explained things when he was the one who knew more. And Daniel was listening in the careful way that meant he was actually following it, not just performing attention. She had watched Daniel with Eli across many of these Saturdays now, and she had cataloged things without meaning to. He never interrupted. He never redirected with "that's cool." But what if he let Eli finish his entire thought? Including the part at the end, where the thought had run a little loose, and Eli wasn't sure how to close it, and he would wait through that part too, and then he'd respond to the thought that had been meant, not just the one that had been said. He treated Eli's ideas seriously without inflating them. He pushed back when Eli was wrong, not harshly, but he didn't let it go either, and she had seen Eli absorb a correction from Daniel, the way he did not always absorb corrections from her, with a kind of equanimity that suggested the correction had come from someone he respected rather than someone he needed to resist. She had not said anything about this to Daniel. She wasn't sure she needed to. She was almost certain he didn't know she was watching. At some point, Eli said something that made Daniel nod slowly, seriously, as if receiving instructions. He picked up a piece of wood and did something with it. Eli examined the result and offered a correction. Daniel corrected his work. Eli approved. They continued. There was a moment she couldn't have said exactly when Eli looked up from the project and said something she couldn't hear through the glass. Something short. 3 syllables, maybe 4. Daniel went still. Not the frozen stillness of shock, but the deep stillness of someone receiving something carefully. The way you receive something breakable when it's handed to you across a distance, with complete attention and both hands. And then he set the piece of wood down and he looked at Eli. And something passed across his face that she had not seen before, something that was not the composed, managed expression he usually carried, but something unguarded and full, something that was held very carefully because, if he didn't hold it carefully, it would become something he'd have to excuse himself for. She didn't need to hear the words to understand what Eli had said. She had been waiting for it, in the back of her awareness, the way you wait for weather you've seen building on the horizon for days, knowing it's coming, not knowing exactly when. He had called him Dad, not because he was confused, not by accident, not in the absent-minded way children sometimes use familiar words for people who are simply present. He had said it the way children say the things they mean plainly, with the full weight of what they intend, without any of the hedging that adults bring to the same word, because adults know what it costs. She set down her coffee and pressed her fingers against the edge of the counter and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She breathed through her nose once, slowly. Then she looked back out the window. Daniel had gathered himself. He had placed one hand briefly on the back of Eli's head, a touch so light it was almost nothing, almost air, and then not air at all, and they had returned to the bird feeder. Eli was already explaining something else, pointing at a specific joint in the wood. And Daniel was nodding. And the yard was still, and the October light was low and golden, and everything looked completely ordinary. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that, her hands wrapped around the cooling coffee, watching 2 people she loved build a thing together in the yard. November. The bird feeder was finished and hung in the backyard maple, and 3 separate bird species had already used it, which Eli had logged in a small notebook with the seriousness of a field researcher. He had assigned each species a rating based on criteria he had not fully explained, but that appeared to involve loyalty, beak style, and whether they stayed long enough to finish what they came for. The Carolina wren had scored highest. The blue jay was on probation. Sophie had come over twice. She and Eli had circled each other with the cautious, evaluative interest of children who understood that something important might be happening, and were not sure whether to approach or observe. By the second visit, they had built a fortress in the living room out of couch cushions and were issuing a set of admission rules that changed every 20 minutes. She was 9 and he was 7, and they had the particular dynamic of children who had decided to be allies, which meant they were allied against everything else in the room equally and entirely. Caroline had watched Sophie across those 2 visits and understood why Daniel talked about her with that particular economy. She was watchful and quick and very funny, in a dry, slightly sideways way that was nothing like Daniel's humor and must have come from Anna. She had her mother's eyes. Daniel had said once, and looking at Sophie, it was easy to imagine a woman who had been precise and observant and quietly fierce, who had named her daughter for someone or something, and taken the reason with her. It was a Wednesday evening, and Sophie was at her grandmother's, and Eli was in bed. And Daniel and Caroline were on the back porch with 2 cups of tea. The yard dark, and the air cold enough to require jackets, the string lights she'd put up in September still on, because she'd never taken them down, and they made the dark feel less empty. The bird feeder was a shadow in the maple. Somewhere on the other side of the fence, their neighbor's dog moved through the fallen leaves with the slow investigative purpose of a dog who has been outside often enough to know there is nothing to find but continues to look. Anyway, he had been quiet for a while in the way that was not uncomfortable, the way that meant something was being organized. "I'm not good at this part," he said. "Which part?" The asking. She looked at him. He was looking at the string lights, and the lights made his face warm and soft. And he looked, in that moment, like a man who had been careful for a very long time and was considering the cost of continuing to be careful. She understood the cost. She had been paying it herself. In a slightly different currency, since the divorce, the cost of maintaining the walls that had been necessary once and had remained standing long after the emergency that built them had passed. "Then don't ask," she said. "Just say it." He turned to look at her. "I want to know if this is what I think it is," he said. "Or whether I've been building something in my head that isn't real." She held the tea in both hands and felt the warmth of it, and she thought about the blind date and the water glass and the crouching down, and both things can be true at once, and the tip and the man at the bar and the paper napkin restaurant in Fort Cheddar and the way he listened and the hand on the back of Eli's head and 6 weeks and Sophie's pressure systems and the small steady fact of him in her kitchen on Saturday mornings. The honey he brought. The book about mountains. The bird feeder finished and hung and doing its work. She thought about Eli waiting at the window again. "It's real," she said. He let out a breath. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the breath of a person who had been holding something for a long time and had been given permission to set it down. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. The lights stayed on. The yard stayed dark. The neighbor's dog found something in the leaves, considered it, and moved on. Somewhere on the other side of the house, a car passed with its radio on, something she didn't recognize. A low pulse of sound that came and faded. They sat on the porch until the tea was cold. And the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. That is simply what it is, the sound of 2 people who have been through things and have arrived, carefully, here. In the morning, when she came downstairs, Eli was already at the kitchen table with his bird notebook in the window. He looked up when she came in. "Daniel coming Saturday?" he asked. "I think so," she said. He nodded and looked back at the window and picked up his pencil and wrote something in his notebook with the focused air of someone maintaining an important record. She made coffee. Outside, in the maple, the bird feeder turned slightly in the morning air, unhurried, oriented by something invisible. Not the end of anything. The beginning of the ordinary, which is the only kind of beginning that lasts.